Jim's peaceful morning shattered the moment he stepped outside and caught sight of his pond. His heart nearly stopped. What had once been a crystal-clear watering hole, home to ducks and fish, was now a disgusting landfill of floating garbage. Plastic bottles bobbed on the surface, greasy fast food wrappers clung to the reeds, and, of all things, a half-deflated pool float shaped like a flamingo lay in the middle of the water, spinning slowly like it was mocking him. But the real kicker? A thick bundle of wet papers drifted near the shore, the ink smudged but still legible. HOA Community Newsletter. And right on top was a name that made his blood boil. Karen. Jim's hands clenched into fists as he yanked the papers from the water, shaking off the muck. Of course, it was her. The self-appointed queen of the nearby HOA, the woman who treated his farm like a personal eyesore, ruining her aesthetic. She had waged war against his property for years, filing bogus complaints, demanding he cut down his trees to improve her view, and even once trying to get the county to force him to modernize his barn. But this was a whole new level of disrespect. She had turned his pond into a personal dumping ground. Rusty, his old farm dog, sniffed at a floating takeout container, then looked up at Jim as if waiting for him to fix it. Jim rubbed the back of his neck, trying to steady his breath. He wasn't a man who lost his temper easily. Farming taught patience, but seeing his land treated like a trash heap ignited something deep and burning inside him. This wasn't going to stand. By the time he reached the HOA meeting hall, Jim had already played out the confrontation in his head a dozen times. He pushed through the glass doors, his boots thudding against the polished floor, and marched straight toward the long conference table where Karen sat, sipping a cappuccino as if she didn't have a care in the world. A few board members glanced up, startled, but Jim wasn't here to make friends. He wasn't even here to be polite. Without a word, he reached into the sack he'd been carrying and dumped the contents onto the table. Empty soda cans clattered, plastic bags crinkled, and the soaked HOA newsletter flopped onto the wood, right in front of Karen's perfectly manicured hand. Gasps echoed around the room. Karen blinked, then wrinkled her nose, delicately pushing the trash away like it might bite her. "Excuse me, what is this?" she said, voice dripping with the same condescension she always used when talking to country folk. Jim crossed his arms. "That's what I'd like to know. Seems someone thought my pond was a garbage disposal. And funny thing, this was in the mix." He tapped the wet newsletter, watching as her expression flickered just slightly. Not guilt. No, Karen didn't do guilt. It was more like irritation, like he was an inconvenience she had no time for. She let out an exaggerated sigh. "Jim, honestly, I have no idea how that got there. This could be from anyone. Maybe some teenagers snuck onto your property." "Teenagers?" Jim raised an eyebrow. "Sure. Teenagers just happened to grab a bunch of HOA paperwork and dump it in my pond? Along with a week's worth of trash." She shrugged. "Who knows? I mean, let's be real. It's not like that pond of yours is some luxury estate feature. It's just she waved a dismissive hand, muddy little swamp, isn't it?" Jim smiled. That slow, knowing kind of smile that usually made people nervous. And Karen should have been nervous, because she had just said the exact thing that was going to ruin her. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough that the room leaned in. "Oh, Karen, you really should have done your research before saying that." He let the silence stretch, savoring the slight twitch in her eye. "That muddy little swamp is actually a protected ecosystem under state environmental laws. You didn't just litter, you committed a violation. And guess what? That comes with fines." Karen's face paled for half a second before she recovered, flipping her hair over her shoulder with a scoff. "Oh, please. You're just trying to scare me." Jim pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "Am I?" He turned the device so she could see it. A photo of the pond, covered in garbage, was displayed. But it wasn't just any photo, it was attached to an official complaint. "Already reported it. And you know what happens when the environmental office investigates. He let out a low chuckle. They don't just fine the person responsible. They fine the entire HOA for allowing it to happen. A chair scraped loudly as one of the board members shot to his feet. Wait, what? His eyes darted between Jim and Karen. Is this true? Jim nodded. They take this stuff seriously. Could be thousands of dollars. He turned his attention back to Karen, who was suddenly looking very, very uncomfortable. Another board member groaned. Karen, tell me you didn't actually do this. She forced a laugh, but it was thin, strained. I mean, even if I did, it's just a little trash. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal? Jim tilted his head. Funny. I seem to recall a certain someone throwing a fit when I left some firewood stacked too close to the property line. But you think dumping garbage into a pond is no big deal. A heavy silence settled over the room. The board members were no longer looking at Jim. They were looking at Karen. And they were not happy. Karen, if this comes back on the HOA, we're holding you responsible, one of them said sharply. Absolutely, another agreed. We can't afford legal trouble over this. Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came out. For the first time in years, she looked truly cornered. Jim took a step back, letting it all sink in. He had done what he came here to do. The seeds had been planted. Now, all he had to do was sit back and watch the fallout. As he turned to leave, he gave Karen one last look. Better start gathering some cash. Something tells me that cleanup isn't gonna be cheap. Rusty greeted him outside, tail wagging as if sensing his victory. Jim scratched behind his ears, letting out a low whistle. This was far from over. It was just getting started. Jim didn't waste any time. The moment he left the HOA meeting, he pulled out his phone and called Randy, his longtime friend and local environmental officer. Randy had dealt with all sorts of cases, from illegal waste dumping to reckless construction violations, and he had a deep appreciation for people who thought they could outsmart environmental laws. When Jim explained the situation, Randy let out a low whistle, clearly entertained. So let me get this straight, Randy said. This woman took her HOA trash and dumped it in your pond, and she actually admitted in front of people that she doesn't think it's a big deal? Jim chuckled. Oh yeah. Right in front of the whole board. Randy laughed, but there was a sharp edge to it. Well, she's about to find out just how big of a deal it is. 2 days later, Jim stood at the edge of his pond, watching as Randy and his team documented the mess. They weren't just taking photos. They were collecting water samples, noting contamination levels, and measuring the impact on local wildlife. Rusty trotted along the shoreline, occasionally sniffing at a piece of garbage before Jim waved him away. Randy stepped up beside Jim, clipboard in hand. You know, this isn't just littering. There are food containers breaking down in the water, plastics leaching chemicals, and God knows what else mixed in here. This could qualify as an environmental hazard. Jim smirked. Good. That'll make the bill even higher. Randy grinned. Oh, don't worry. She's not getting away with this. I'll file my report by the end of the day, and trust me, the fine's gonna make her regret every piece of trash she dumped. By the time the official paperwork went through, the fine wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. Karen had been slapped with a $10,000 environmental cleanup bill, with additional penalties if she didn't take immediate action. The best part? Since the trash had originated from the HOA, the board was also facing consequences. Jim didn't have to wait long to see the fallout. At the next HOA meeting, he arrived just in time to see Karen arguing with the board, her voice shrill enough to pierce through the walls. The moment he stepped inside, all eyes turned to him, and the tension in the air was so thick it felt like walking into a powder keg moments before the explosion. Karen, red-faced and furious, pointed a trembling finger at him. You did this. You're trying to ruin me. Jim raised an eyebrow. I didn't dump the trash in my own pond, Karen. That was all you. One of the board members, An older man who looked like he'd had enough of Karen's antics, sighed and rubbed his temples. Karen, this is serious. The HOA is now involved in an environmental case because of your actions. We can't afford this kind of liability. Karen scoffed. Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. We can just ignore it. It's not like they're going to actually enforce the fine. Jim smirked. Oh, they'll enforce it. And if you don't pay, they'll escalate it to legal action. You know, lawyers, court dates, and possibly even a lawsuit against the HOA. I'm sure your neighbors would love that. Karen paled slightly, but she wasn't done fighting. You're exaggerating. This is just a stupid pond. Another board member shook her head. Karen, stop talking. The entire room erupted into bickering. Half of the board wanted Karen to pay out of pocket, while the other half was horrified at the idea of the HOA being held responsible. Karen, of course, refused to take full responsibility, arguing that everyone dumps a little trash now and then. Jim folded his arms and leaned against the wall, enjoying the spectacle. He had dealt with stubborn farm animals before, but even a mule was easier to reason with than Karen. Finally, after what felt like an hour of heated debate, the board reached a decision. Karen would be forced to fund the cleanup herself, and if she refused, she would be removed from the HOA entirely. That was when the real fun began. Jim showed up the next morning, coffee in hand, to see Karen knee-deep in the pond, wearing a pair of designer rain boots that were quickly getting ruined by the murky water. A few other HOA members stood on the shore, watching as she gagged and complained while pulling plastic bags and half-eaten food containers out of the water. Jim strolled up next to one of the neighbors, an older woman named Margaret who had always hated Karen's attitude. Well, Margaret said, sipping her tea, I never thought I'd see the day. Jim grinned. You and me both. Karen let out a dramatic wail as she pulled out a bloated cardboard box, flinging it onto the shore like it personally offended her. This is disgusting. I shouldn't have to do this. One of the board members, arms crossed, stared at her blankly. You dumped it. You clean it. Jim pulled out his phone and took a picture, making sure to get a good shot of Karen's miserable expression. He didn't even have to post it. Someone else had already beaten him to it. Within hours, a video of Karen's pond-cleaning misery was making the rounds in the neighborhood group chats, and then somehow, beyond that. By the next day, she was the star of an unexpected viral sensation. Trash Queen Karen. The internet had taken the footage and run with it, adding dramatic music, slow-motion zoom-ins, and captions about instant karma. Karen's meltdown, her exaggerated gags, and her frustrated screams were replayed thousands of times, turning her into an unwilling meme. Jim figured that was enough karma for one day, but then something even better happened. A few days after the cleanup, Jim received an envelope in the mail. He expected another useless HOA letter, maybe some weak attempt at retaliation, but when he opened it, he found something that made him laugh out loud. A check for $10,000. And a handwritten note. Thanks for finally humbling her. I should have done it years ago. It was signed by Karen's husband. Jim stood on his porch, shaking his head in disbelief, Rusty wagging his tail at his feet. He had expected revenge. He had expected justice. But he hadn't expected that. Maybe, just maybe, even Karen's own household was ready for a little peace and quiet. Jim sat on his porch, turning the check over in his hands, still amused by the unexpected turn of events. He had won. Not just in the way he originally planned, but in every possible way. Karen had been humiliated, forced to clean up her own mess, and then, in the greatest twist of all, her own husband had thanked Jim for putting her in her place. It was almost poetic. Rusty lay beside him, chewing lazily on a stick, his tail thumping against the wooden planks. The town had been buzzing ever since the viral video took off. Everyone had seen Karen, knee-deep in muck, wailing about how unfair life was while pulling her own trash out of the pond. Jim had even heard that a local news station was interested in running a segment on it, though he wasn't sure if Karen would survive the embarrassment of that level of publicity. The HOA had distanced themselves from her almost immediately after the video spread, and rumors swirled that they were already looking for a way to officially strip her of any power in the neighborhood. Jim figured it was only a matter of time. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, he heard the news. Karen had been voted out of the HOA board in a landslide decision. Even the few allies she had left had abandoned her after the fine, realizing she was more of a liability than an asset. Jim ran into Margaret at the farmer's market, and she couldn't wait to tell him all about it. "Oh, it was glorious," she said, practically bouncing with excitement as she picked through fresh tomatoes. She tried to fight it, of course. Went on and on about how she was being targeted, and that it wasn't fair, but nobody was buying it. One of the board members even pulled up the video in the middle of the meeting. She stormed out before the vote was even finished, but the decision was unanimous. Jim grinned as he handed her a bag of vegetables. "Can't say I'm surprised. She was always more of a dictator than a leader." Margaret laughed. "Well, she's a powerless dictator now. And between you and me, I heard she's thinking about selling her house. Says she doesn't feel welcome in the community anymore." Jim let out a low whistle, pretending to be shocked. "You don't say. If Karen really did move, it would be the ultimate conclusion to this entire mess." He had half a mind to go over and personally help pack her bag. But for now, he was content to sit back and let nature take its course. With Karen out of the picture, things in the neighborhood took an unexpected turn. Without her constant complaints and ridiculous rules, people actually started relaxing. Jim noticed that his neighbors seemed friendlier, less uptight. One day, a group of HOA members even approached him with an offer. "We were thinking," one of them said, shuffling awkwardly, "since your pond is such a beautiful spot, maybe we could work together on turning it into a community space. Not a public thing, obviously, but maybe a small fishing area, a picnic spot. Something nice for families." Jim had to admit the idea wasn't bad. He had spent years keeping the pond pristine, not just for himself but for the wildlife that relied on it. If he could turn it into something that benefited the neighborhood without the interference of the HOA's nonsense rules, it might just be worth considering. "I'll think about it," he said, and the group nodded, clearly relieved he hadn't shot them down immediately. He did more than think about it. A few weeks later, Jim met with an environmental specialist to discuss the best way to keep the pond clean while allowing light recreational use. They worked out a plan that would maintain the ecosystem, prevent future pollution, and still allow people to enjoy the space. As the new community project took shape, Karen became more and more of a ghost. She no longer strutted around acting like she owned the place. She avoided the HOA meetings altogether. Every once in a while, Jim would catch a glimpse of her peering through her curtains, but for the most part, she had retreated into her house, a shell of the loud, demanding woman she had once been. Then, one day, the for sale sign appeared in her yard. Jim wasn't the only one who noticed. The whole neighborhood started whispering about it, speculating on why she was leaving. Some said she was moving to a new HOA where she could reclaim her power. Others claimed she was running from the embarrassment of the viral video. Whatever the reason, no one seemed particularly sad to see her go. The day the moving trucks arrived, Jim stood by his fence, watching as Karen's overpriced furniture was loaded up. She spotted him across the yard, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was no glare, no snarky remark, no dramatic farewell speech. Instead, she simply looked away, climbed into her car, and drove off without another word. Jim let out a slow breath, feeling an unexpected sense of finality. It was over. Really over. Rusty trotted up beside him, wagging his tail as if sensing his relief. Jim reached down and gave the dog a good scratch behind the ears. "Looks like we won, boy," he said with a chuckle. The weeks that followed were some of the most peaceful Jim had experienced in years. Without Karen's constant interference, the community actually started feeling like a community. The pond restoration project was a success, and Jim even hosted a small barbecue to celebrate its completion. Families came out, kids played near the water, and for the first time in a long time, people actually enjoyed being part of the neighborhood. As Jim sat in his favorite rocking chair that evening, watching the sun set over the now pristine pond, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Karen had thought she could do whatever she wanted, that she was above consequences. But nature had a way of balancing things out, and in the end, karma had done all the work for him.